Hi, everyone, and welcome to Black in Focus. I'm Karen Toulon here at Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York, and today we're in for a real treat, because we're talking about food and drink with Clay Williams and with Colleen Vincent. Clay is a photographer, well known in the food industry, and Colleen Vincent is the VP of Community at the James Beard Foundation. So you started Black Food Folks back in 2019 to be a resource and a community for Black people who are in the foods and drinks industry.
Clay and I met through, we had a mutual friend, Nicole Taylor. We would be remiss in not mentioning her. But we had traveled in the same circles, and there was this desire for community that was percolating throughout the community. And because Clay and I, had had several discussions with others and with each other, it just so happened that I had a space, we had a guest list, we came up with this idea to just get everyone in the same room. And then Black Food Folks was born.
If you go to a food event, there are maybe 3 or 4 Black people out of 100, 200, 500 people in the room. And the folks who throw these events always say that they just don't, they just can't find Black folks. They don't know where these, where we are. We're some sort of we're some sort of mythical creatures, right? In terms of the audience, or the people who are writing or any of that, that PR people and event planners are targeting, somehow, there's just a little sprinkling. The seasoning, as our friend Asai said, we would end up having to talk to each other to try to figure out, well, how do you succeed in this business?
So how do you succeed? COVID, of course, then happens. According to the National Bureau of Economic Research, of the businesses that failed during COVID in 2020, 41% were Black owned and 17% were white owned. I mean, these economic upheavals do hit Black and brown companies and people and professionals differently. Colleen, how big is your network, and what kind of, not just camaraderie, but how does that support actually play out in terms of dollars? I spoke to Stephen Satterfield, host of Pie on the Hog, over the summer. We talked about how the contributions of Black people to American culture and American cuisine is just undervalued, and kind of as an offshoot of that, the financial abilities, the access to capital for Black and brown businesses are also undervalued.
In terms of actual numbers, Black Food Folks itself, on our Instagram page, we have over 40,000 followers. Our email list is hundreds and hundreds of people. There has always been, and there is, a hunger for Black stories, not just from Black people. If I may be frank, I think Black people, the diaspora, are some of the most fascinating people in the world. And you can see that in the way culture plays out in terms of what people have deemed as delicious or cool or interesting stories. So when Black businesses go under, what you're talking about is not just sorely needed capital injected into the community, but also cultural context being lost.
You also have a relationship with Toulon, the ice cream company. You partnered with them, and I think you handed out last November about 10 grants of about $5,000 each. How's that program working, and how much of a difference can $5,000 make?
We have a new season of Black Desserts, the podcast that just recently launched. The host is Therese Nelson, who's a brilliant food historian and chef. And Talenti approached us looking for a way to help support the work that we've been doing in spreading the voices of the community. And, it was a sort of open-ended, here's some money, do with it what you need to build your organization. And because our organization is about supporting the community, we wanted to make sure that work wasn't just going, that funding wasn't just going into building Black Food Folks, but also building other organizations. Amber Mayfield, who has While Entertaining magazine, she was raising funds for the next issue of that magazine. There's Tiffany Rosier, who was in the midst of trying to raise $10,000 to do the new season of her podcast. So, I mean, our one grant was able to get her halfway there. There are organizations that feed the hungry in their communities, and every dollar counts.
Do you have any other corporate sponsors who are kind of waiting in the wings?
We have had some inquiries. Truthfully speaking, just like our relationship with Talenti, we signed NDAs before we before we announced partnerships.
Right.
One very public partnership we had last year was with Discover, which was really exciting, and also a further way of getting the community involved in how we invest in the community.
So many companies have been doing these really big pledges in the wake of the racial reckoning. Are these smaller, more bespoke type grants and support that you might get from corporations? Is that particularly helpful?
When you're talking about people who have small non-for-profits, that they've just started, small businesses, $5,000 means rent and lights on, right? And, as we've seen during COVID, during this entire pandemic, that the stress of having to do those kinds of things can take you away from the creative process. Sometimes it's not about growth like outward, it's about development inward. And, our grants have made a big impact.
A couple of months ago, I spoke with Rosa of the Wu-Tang Clan, who's vegan, and I'm telling you, talking with him about food got me as close to being vegan as I will ever get. It was truly inspirational. Are there any food trends or any kind of things that we should be thinking about, foods that we should be thinking about as we go into this holiday season? Are there any new things that you're excited about? Clay, what have you been taking pictures of recently?
Yeah.
That should be on my table this season.
Right. I can't speak to trends specifically. Those seem to sort of pop up out of nowhere. But for me, at least, I'm given the 2 years that we had, I'm thinking about comfort, and I'm thinking about connection.
What I'm grateful for is that it seems, there's a trend towards chefs and culinary creators being inspired by themselves and their backgrounds, as opposed to what's the latest and greatest in the magazine. And so I feel like there's a creative freedom that comes from that, that allows people to not compete, just do what they do best. I think people are going to experiment more with flavors of West Africa and the diaspora, because it's become more and more apparent how impactful West African cuisine has been certainly on the New World, if not the global food scene. And I think people are really excited to kind of explore more and more of the countries of the continent. I think what I'm most excited about emotionally is that things that were kind of, anecdotal and things that were whispered about have been laid bare by the pandemic. And so we can have like real and very frank conversations about what people need. And I think also people are more willing to listen to what the community says instead of dictate what we think people need to do things and to go forward. I think we're going to value the independent restaurant, the independent chef, the independent culinary producer a lot more going forward.
I want to thank you both for sharing your time with us and your thoughts on food and drink, especially at this time of year and looking ahead to 2022. Our guests today were Clay Williams and Colleen Vincent. Coming up next week, another great story, another great interview. Until then, I'm Karen Toulon for Bloomberg.